Hello, this is Bad Vibes. Today's video is featuring Lighthouse Horror, a good friend of mine. He'll be reading two stories, so make sure you sub if you like him. If you can't tell already, my voice is a little weird. I'm losing it a little bit. I've been sick the last few days, but I try to record, so it's a little off in this video, but I hope you still like it. Make sure you hit the like button and sit back, relax, and enjoy. I don't know if this is interesting, but it creeps me out to this day. I was in 6th grade, and every day after school, I would usually walk home up this hill. The bus stop isn't that far away from my home, so I never really questioned for my safety while walking home. I end school at 3:10 p.m., but get home around 4:30, and my mom goes to work from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. I never really knew my dad's schedule, and every day one of my 4 brothers would be home waiting for me. That day, I was walking home and a man on a bike was riding on the sidewalk across from me. He kept staring at me, but I didn't think it was such a big deal at first. I started walking further and noticed he was going the same way as me. My mom warned me that if that ever happens, I should call her or take another route home because there are 2 different routes. I didn't want to bother her, so I took the other route, and I noticed that the man on the bike took the usual route that I take home on a daily basis. I assumed that he was a neighbor I've never seen before. Finally, I get home, and I saw my dad in the garage talking to the guy on the bike. I felt this really weird feeling in my stomach. I said hi to my dad, and he introduced me to the guy on the bike as one of his close friends of years. Keep this in mind that we are a close family, so I pretty much know all of my parents' friends. I quickly let go of all the bad thoughts going through my head. The next morning, I told my mom about it. We saw the same guy that morning in our garage. Turns out, my mom had never seen that man before either. If my dad and this guy were so close, how come my mom has never heard of him? For a few months, I keep seeing this guy around my house, and steered clear of him. By now, he was familiar with everyone's schedule, so he knows when no one's home, and when I come home from school. One day I decided to get off at my friend's bus stop, so that we could walk to 7-Eleven to get some candies and snacks. Since I got off the bus at her stop, I got home earlier than usual. When I got there, one of my older brothers was sitting on the steps because he forgot his key and he wanted to change before he went out to skate with his friends. So me and him entered the house at the same time. The guy that rides a bike was in the house alone, stealing my dad's money and other valuables. When he saw us, he pulled out a sharp object. My brother is much larger than him and quickly got the weapon out of his hand and held him down. I quickly called my dad, and he called the police. Everything got handled pretty quickly, thanks to my brother. They questioned the guy, and he said he was planning to rob us, then silence anyone that tried to stop him. Even though everything was handled, I still dwell on it. What if my brother decided to skate with his friends without changing? What if my brother couldn't get the weapon out of his hand? What if I got home at the regular time, and the guy ended up taking all my dad's money? My biggest concern is, what if I entered the house alone? What if he purposely did the robbery right before I would get home from school? I don't know, but I still have these thoughts. After all that, we put up cameras around the outside of our house to ensure no one would get in, unless they've been invited in. Always watch out for strangers and follow your gut, even if your parents say the person's safe. For some context, aside from the 10 years I lived in California, between the ages of 20 and 30, I lived in Okinawa, Japan, for most of my life. Japan is known to be one of the safest countries in the world. As someone who lived in both Japan and America, I can confirm this, even after almost being kidnapped twice. Let's say I've been some shit in the States, which will be for another story for another post. Anyway, to keep this story short, in this post, I'm going to share the first time I was almost kidnapped. At the time of this story, the year was around 1996. This time period matters, and you'll see why. It's most likely what saved my life. I was about 7 or 8 at the time, and I was hanging out at my mom's pharmacy, which I did often while she was working. Her pharmacy was a convenient 5-minute walk from my grandmother's house, so as a little kid, I would walk back and forth from the pharmacy to my grandmother's house, based on who I wanted to spend time with. Now, as I said earlier, I was almost kidnapped twice, once by an American and once by a Japanese man. This incident involved the American. Okinawa has the biggest American military presence in the Pacific, so seeing other people other than Japanese was very common, and me being half American, I've always had a sense of familiarity with them. It was coming up on dinner time, so my mom suggested I walk over to my grandmother's house for dinner. I agreed, and started to make my usual walk from my mom's pharmacy to my grandmother's house. The street I walked was busy, cars constantly zooming past, and considering it was afternoon rush hour, there were more cars than usual. I was maybe about halfway to my grandmother's house when out of the corner of my eye I noticed a black car slowing down to my pace alongside me. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Parking spaces in Japan were limited, and the road I walked was lined with different businesses. So I figured whoever was in the black car was just slowing down to park their car on the side of the road, because they were going to go to one of the stores. I wasn't expecting what happened next. I heard the window roll down, and the man's voice call out to me, "Hey girl." I wasn't expecting to hear English, so it jolted me, and I looked up. An American man, still in his military uniform, was slightly leaning over the passenger side. He kept looking at me, and his eyes would occasionally dart to the front of the car to make sure he didn't hit into anything. I stopped, and he stopped his car. I was wondering if he was going to ask me for directions or something, but I didn't say anything to him. I just stared at him. In my own little way, I was studying him, trying to feel his energy. He was smiling, but something about him was giving me bad vibes. He waited for a few seconds to see if I would speak, but since I didn't, he continued. "You don't know me, but I'm friends with your dad," he said with a smile. "He asked me to give you a ride home." This confused me. Even at nighttime, my parents allowed me to walk back and forth between my mom's pharmacy and my grandma's house. After all, it was a busy street, only about 5 minutes walk. They rarely ever drove me to and back. Plus, where I was standing at the moment, I was pretty much halfway there. I told the man that it was okay and that I didn't need a ride, since my grandma's house was right around the corner. The smile on his lips started to waver. "But your dad insisted I take you," he said, trying to keep a calm, happy voice. He even said that we can go pick up some ice cream. This is when the year comes into play. About a year before this, in 1995, 3 U.S. servicemen rented a van and kidnapped a local 12-year-old girl. They beat her, duct taped her eyes and mouth shut, bound her hands, then took turns raping her. This incident caused a local uproar and created massive tension between the United States military and the Okinawan citizens. There wasn't a single man, woman, or child who didn't know about this case. Even though I was young at the time, and I didn't understand the gravity of the situation to the full extent, I still even knew about the story, and it made me cautious of strangers. I shook my head and declined the man. The smile completely disappeared from his face as anger started to show. "Get in the car, you little shit." And at that moment I ran. Since I grew up in this area, I knew it like the back of my hand. I darted into a short alleyway nearby, in between a karaoke place and a rotisserie chicken shop. I ran to the street on the other side, which was the same street my grandma's house was on. I know now that the guy wasn't going to chase me in broad daylight, especially being in his military uniform. After the incident with a 12-year-old local girl, him chasing me would have raised immediate suspicion. There was no way he would have risked it. But at the same time, I didn't even try to look back. I just assumed that he was following me. I ran as fast as my little legs could. I was getting out of breath, and it felt like the sides of my stomach was going to split open. I was probably 2 blocks from my grandmother's house, but it felt so far away. Eventually I got there, pulled open the front door and ran into the house, forgetting to take off my shoes, and collapsed in my grandmother's arms. Later that night, my dad came home to pick me up, and I told him what happened. I was hoping that it was just my misunderstanding, and that my dad really did send his friend for whatever reason. But the moment I told him what happened, his face fell. He had a mixture of fear and anger on his face, and he hugged me so tight. Being American, especially being associated with the military, was difficult at that time, due to the tension created by those 3 idiot servicemen from the years prior. My dad's biggest pet peeve was the US military and their affiliates doing stupid shit and making the rest of the foreigners look bad. I don't know if my dad ever did anything with the information I gave him. If he did, it didn't go anywhere, at least not that I know of. I walked back and forth from my grandmother's house to my mom's pharmacy many times before this incident and since, and never saw this man again. Dude in black car, let's not meet again. About 15 years ago, when I was 22-ish, my best girl and I went out to bars 3 or 4 nights a week, and generally met some interesting people, and made some new friends. There were a few bars that we would hit up more than others, and one in particular that we knew the bartender manager pretty well. We went this week of Halloween, and each night the staff would dress up in different costumes. This is where we came across Ron. He was a bouncer at the bar, and didn't catch my eye at the slightest as I gave him my ID to get in. Until a few years ago, I never looked anyone in the face. I had to force myself to do it. My girl and I hung out, drank and danced, met some people, and then headed up to the bar to chat with our friend. He asked me what I thought about Ron. I had no idea what he meant, and he gestured to the bouncer. To which I was like, meh. He was older looking, very muscular, and I was 22-ish, dressed in black and skulls, and platforms. He didn't seem to be my type on the outside, but my bartender friend vouched for him, said he was a really cool guy, and asked me if he could give Ron my number, and I figured it would be okay. I hear from him the next day, and he wants to hang. At the time, I lived with my uncle and aunt, pastor and his wife, so he invited me to meet at his place, and we would just have a casual hang somewhere. Simple middle of the day chill. I get to his apartment, and his door is wide open, and his much better looking, married, and closer to my age best friend is there. He seems nice enough, and it didn't feel unsafe that they had left the door wide open. And again, my bartender friend had vouched for him. He mentions that he needs to grab a few supplies, so the 3 of us pile into his douchey car and head to the office supply store. We go in, and as we walk in, a pretty girl walks by, and he does the head thing and completely stares at her, like he obviously follows her with his head. We aren't together, but I found that to be rude. So later in the car I mention it. I tell him, hey look, I know that we're just hanging out, but don't disrespect me like that. Everyone looks, but be less obvious and don't make me look like an ass in public. He laughs and tells me that it's hot that I stood up for myself, especially on our first hangout. We go back to his place, and as we walk inside, he says, I like that. You're gonna have a ring on your finger by December. Remember, we met Halloween week. So anyway, his friend leaves. We get takeout and hang out and drink and just talk. Turns out he's from the same tiny town that my parents are from, which is 6 hours south of us. He is a Desert Storm veteran, which makes him more than 20 years older than me, and he was back in school to finish his degree, worked full-time during the week, and bounced at nights and on the weekends. Seemed decent. He asked about my tattoos. I have a lot, and we talked about my love of horror and my fascination with true crime and serial killers. He seemed interested, but says he doesn't know much about them, so I tell him I'll lend him my encyclopedia of serial killers, so it can be like a crash course for him. Maybe a week later we hung out again, and I bring him the book. We hang multiple times, and I even sleep there a few times. One day we were hanging out and drinking heavily. He says something to me that felt very much like he was getting too comfortable too fast, like telling me to do something. I told him not to speak to me like that, and turned to walk away when my head is jerked back. He had grabbed my hair at the base of my neck. I grabbed his hand, and he tried to laugh it off and apologized, saying that he didn't mean to be that rough and tried to act like it was some sort of foreplay. But I cut that off real quick. I wanted to leave, but I was already very buzzed, so I just sat there, and he said he was going to do some work. I thought I would just let the buzz wear off, head home, and never talk to this guy again. While I'm sitting there and he's working, he suddenly decides to tell me graphic details of his favorite serial killer in the book so far, and why. I think that the way he's talking about it seems off, but again, I was just waiting out my buzz. He started working on his assignment, and he is studying urban legends and such. He plays a video with horrible creepy content, and it's creeping me out. I realized later that I felt that way, because I didn't feel safe with him. I asked him to wait until I was gone to play it out loud, or put on headphones, and he laughs at me. Tells me that he can't believe I'm such a poser. Tells me, "You have all those tattoos and skulls, and really, you're scared? You look all goth or punk rock, but you're terrified?" He laughs a scary laugh. He's really enjoying that it creeps me out. I don't want to drive, even mildly buzzed. I tell him that his reaction is scaring me, and he loves it. His face gets completely serious, and all of a sudden he tells me that he has a machete under his mattress. I look and see the handle barely sticking out. He tells me that he can make me disappear, and nobody would find my body. In that moment, adrenaline hit. I grabbed my bag and ran to my car. He sort of slowly lumbered behind me, laughing at me and telling me not to leave. I'm stone cold sober at this point. Adrenaline, I guess. Start my car and take off. About 2 minutes down the road, by the mall, I just park and slow my breathing. I call my girl just to unload. For the next week, he texts and calls me over and over, switching between begging me to give him another chance, to berating me and calling me a poser and a fake. I tell my bartender friend, and he can't believe that Ron did all those things. He only works with him a few more times, and they don't talk. Ron set his sights on someone new, another chick in her early 20s. Her family owns the Vietnamese restaurant in the same strip as the bar. Bartender tells us Ron had just started seeing her, and she ended up pregnant immediately. I asked the bartender to warn her, and gave her my number, but never saw her again. I hope and pray that she didn't get stuck with Ron, and every time I'm in the area, I pray I don't run into him again. He can keep the encyclopedia. I just hope he hasn't picked up any tips from it.
Okay, so back when I was in the military, I was based out in California. This was pretty much right at the start of the housing bust, and I found myself newly divorced following a deployment. As such, I could no longer live on base and had to move. I quickly discovered that it now was the same price or cheaper to rent a house instead of an apartment off base, So I got in touch with a realtor who worked with residents of a local gated community. As a newly single female with zero family in the area, I thought extra security could only be a good thing. I soon found the perfect house. It was amazing. It had a wraparound porch with a view of the lake in the center of the community, had trees blocking my views of the neighbors, an awesome kitchen, and tons of local wildlife. I could easily see myself recovering from what had been an ungodly rough year. The owner mostly lived overseas, so I never really dealt with him except when I moved, but he seemed really nice, if a bit particular. He obviously loved the house, so I didn't think much of that. The 2 times I needed something looked after, his brother came to deal with them as he was a handyman of sorts. I always found it a bit weird that him and his brother looked like they could have been twins, to the point where I thought his brother was him when he came to pick up the dryer when it needed fixing. Literally, he picked it up and carried it out in his arms. A funny thing about PTSD brain, though, is that lots of normal things seem weird, while strange things seem normal. So I never really thought of the landlord-brother situation as odd until after. Maybe it was normal and the whole oddness of what happened is setting off my paranoia. I don't really know. But yeah, landlord odd, brother was apparently the Hulk. Both spoke to me like I was their kid who needed very strict instructions. Anyway, I enjoyed my time in the house. My pup loved it too because the next door neighbors had dogs for her to play with. But my PTSD and other mental health issues had me on a path headed straight for a medical separation. But then the president issued a series of rollback programs, a chance for military members to separate ahead of contract in anticipation for the Middle Eastern conflicts to be abandoned, and my commander highly suggested, if you're military, you know this basically means do this or else, for me to take the early separation. There were a few reasons surrounding this, but the main was that Squadron knew they were the reason I was mentally fracked up, and there were more than a few of the people who had it in for me still at the clinic I was assigned to. Those people kept writing me up for things no one else would get written up for. Examples of this: accidentally jamming the shredder that jammed at least once a week, leaving the front desk unattended while I was having an anaphylactic attack, having a panic attack, which left work unattended because I was literally curled into a ball in the corner. You get the picture. Of course, my brain took most of this stuff at face value and figured it was okay and I deserved it. But my commander was trying to protect me as best she could and get me out of a clearly hostile work environment ASAP. So I applied and was approved for separation. Now, this meant I was leaving my lease before the year was out. I forget if my landlord just decided to be nice or if I had to pull out a law about military members being entitled to early release from a lease when their duty assignments changed. Probably the second one because he wasn't happy. I didn't really have the mental capacity to care too much about putting him out though, because my scrambled brains all of a sudden had a lot of military paperwork and processing to deal with. Not to mention the fact that the whole idea that I was separating felt very surreal in the first place. I'd always thought I'd be a lifer. I didn't tell any of my neighbors I was moving. Only one of my friends knew when exactly I was moving out, and even my movers didn't know exactly when, because I stayed there on an air mattress for about a week after they picked up my things. I was camping my way across country on my way home, so I had a lot of stuff to move in my car too. To the best of my knowledge, no one on the base knew exactly when my house would be vacant either, because I actually stayed in a motel off base for a few days after I moved out, just to make the final days of last-minute paperwork easier. The house was about 40 minutes from my base, while the motel was 10. They knew what my travel plans. I was on separation leave for that time, which meant I was technically still in the military and they needed to know exactly where I was, but I had marked my starting location for the trip as my base, not the house. What you should be getting out of this is that only 2 people for sure knew the exact date I was leaving the house. My friend and my landlord. He'd likely told his brother and his realtor as well, but I'm not sure. That said, even my landlord didn't know the exact date I'd be leaving the area, just when I'd vacate the premises. My landlord had told me to drop my house keys in the realtor's mailbox, so that's what I did. And a few days later, I left on my road trip home. Now, about a day later, I get a phone call from my landlord. I'm on the road with my pup when I answer. The conversation follows.
Hey, you left your camera here.
Are you sure?
Yeah, it's a Nikon with a nice set of lenses and a camera bag.
Oh, I don't really have one of those.
Really? My brother said you did.
I try to think back, and I remember his brother coming over to drop off, again literally with his arms, the dryer, while my sister and nephew were in town. She's an avid photographer, and I figure she must have had the camera bag out in preparation for our day trip to San Francisco. The conversation continued. No, I only have one of those Canons that can fit in your pocket. He must be thinking of my sister's, but she for sure brought that home with her months ago. The landlord is silent for a little while.
Well, what about this sleeping bag that's here?
No, I definitely have my sleeping bag. The landlord described my sleeping bag exactly. No, I have mine. I slept in it last night. The landlord is quiet again before answering.
There's a backpack, too, with a few random items.
His tone then changed to accusatory.
Did you tell one of your friends you could stay here for the rest of your lease?
No. Only one of my friends even knows exactly when I moved out, and he's visiting his wife who's deployed in Korea right now.
Well, someone's been living here.
At this point, it should have occurred to me how weird it was that he'd gone from friendly, hey, you forgot this, to angry, you let someone squat here so quickly. But it was only just getting through my head that someone had clearly moved in the moment I moved out. This house didn't have an attic, so this couldn't have been one of those someone was living in the attic while I was living there and moved down into the main house later situations. There wasn't a sealed off part of the house where this could be done, and I even went into the basement on a regular basis. It's possible someone was living in the woods behind the house, but I have no idea. Anyway, my landlord wanted me to come over and check the stuff to make sure it wasn't mine. I told him that I'd finished up my paperwork, so I was on the road and already in Oregon. He clearly hadn't expected me to already have left the area, since I still had a few days on my lease. Yes, it should have struck me as weird that he was already in the house, but I figured he'd picked up the keys and knew I was out, and told me he'd have to call me back after he figured things out. He never called back. I texted him later to follow up, but all I got were short no responses to my questions. No, they didn't know whose stuff it was. No answer when I told him I was freaked out and wanted to know what had happened. Yes, he'd gotten both sets of keys from the realtor. No, he hadn't found anything else. Not long after I got my full deposit back, which I hadn't been expecting since I felt bad for not staying my whole lease. I hadn't even planned on asking for it. It wasn't until relaying this all to my mom later that I realized exactly how weird the whole thing was, or that my landlord might have been making up the squatter. She pointed out how strange it was that a guy who was supposedly traveling too much to use his own house would show up himself to walk through the house after I left, but before he picked up the keys or the lease was up, especially since his brother did everything while I lived there. Neither of us are really sure if he was up to something, or if there really had been some extremely creepy stalker or squatter situation. Either way, the whole thing seriously messed with my already messed up head. My experience with the Church of Scientology. This happened when I was around 17 years old, and it's still happening now. At 17, I felt lost in the world and stuck in a job I disliked with work colleagues that didn't like me. This had to do with my accent, as I was quite well spoken, so they thought I was a rich kid. It all started on a Friday after work. The factory I worked in had a half day on Fridays, so I would spend the rest of the day wandering around the city I lived in. It had been a tough day of relentless mocking, and I was reaching my breaking point. I went around the city looking for a new job. I visited the police recruitment center, the Army, Navy and Air Force centers, and even the International Red Cross. I just wanted to get away from it all. After a few hours, I had a bag full of career pamphlets and still no idea what to do with my life. I turned a corner and immediately saw a sign sitting in front of me. I can remember it so vividly now. It said, "Free personality test. Are you curious about yourself? Come in." I then looked up at the building and I saw a big fancy sign outside saying, "The Church of Scientology." Now, before I continue, yes, I already knew about Scientology. However, I had a morbid curiosity about it. I'd heard all the horror stories and goings-on inside of the church. But Tom Cruise was my favorite actor, and he seemed to have his life sorted out pretty well. My famous last words right there. So, I went inside. I was immediately greeted by a very nice lady. She asked me how I was doing and what she could do for me today. I asked if I could speak to somebody about the church and the personality test. She smiled and said, "I would be happy to. Please take a seat and I will get you someone to speak with." After a minute, I was introduced to an older man named Alan, and he was the head of my city's Scientology Center. Alan took me to a small room to talk privately. When we entered, I immediately noticed a large picture of L. Ron Hubbard on the wall. We sat down and genially had a nice talk. I told him about how I was unhappy about where life was going. I told him about how I wanted to leave, plus all the trouble I was having at work. He seemed genuinely concerned for me, and I felt like he wanted to help. After a while of talking, I agreed to do the personality test. He gave me the test and left the room, saying to give the test to the receptionist after I finished. 2 hours later, I finished it. Not joking, that's really how long it took. It was around 500 questions about anything and everything. I handed it to the receptionist, and she told me it would take some time to process. In the meantime, Alan had told her to take me to their private cinema and show me a film. I thought it was just going to be some old room in the back with a TV on the wall. But no, they did indeed have a private cinema. It could seat around 50 people and had a large screen in the front. It did feel a bit weird just being myself in a cinema owned by Scientology, but I bet that hasn't happened to many people. Or maybe it has. Anyway, I sat down and they played me the film. It was about 30 minutes long and consisted of a narrator explaining those strange feelings you sometimes get, with some mediocre acting following along. I remember a section about how much you doubt yourself, knowing you have locked a door but going back to check multiple times. At one point, the film showed how a past event that happened to your mother while she was pregnant with you could affect your life in a negative way. Example, your mother was sick on a flight, so you were scared of flying. I also vaguely remember something about rotten eggs and how much an event involving them can hurt you. I know it sounds absurd, but in some ways the film really made sense to me. When the film was done, I was taken to Alan's office and he told me my results. He told me I was extremely depressed, one of the most unmotivated people he had ever met, lacking cognitive thinking, and I was a waste of talent. Now, this made me very upset, but Alan said he could help me. He gave me about 4 books and a DVD. He told me to read the books and watch the film before my course. I asked, what course? And Alan told me he had signed me up to do a course at the center. He convinced me that if I didn't do this course, that my life would soon spiral out of control. He made me hand over quite a lot of money for the course and said I would receive an email about the course, which was in a month's time. I left the center, ran home, and immediately started reading the books I was given. This happened all over the weekend. I had basically locked myself in my room and did nothing but read and reread those books and watch the DVD over and over again. Over the next week, I began taking notes about myself and my family. I emailed Alan with questions and concerns. I started resenting my mother for my life. I began to think that she was the problem, that everything bad that happened to me was the result of her. I started to treat her badly. I was swearing at her and ignoring her. When I emailed Alan about my mother, he told me that if she was the catalyst for my problems, then maybe I should consider disconnecting from her. And I took that bullshit seriously. I made plans to totally leave her out of my life. A week before my course, I developed some kind of God complex towards everyone around me. What I read in those books told me what I could become. I saw everyone in my family as below me. I really became a truly spiteful person. Just days before my course, I was confronted by my mother and father. They said they were concerned about me and they searched my room. My dad took out all of the Scientology books and the DVD, and I was outraged. I screamed and cursed at my parents. I said horrible, wicked things to them. I told them how I was going to leave them and how I never wanted to see them again. Hours of arguing back and forth, tears and crying. However, in the end, they did convince me that the church was a bad place. They said if I was so miserable at work, I should have told them. And that was true. To this day, I can't believe I didn't say anything to them. Instead, I went to Scientology. That night, after the arguing had stopped, they sat me down and comforted me. I really couldn't believe it. After the way I had treated them for the past 3 weeks, they still cared for me. The next day, I emailed Alan, and I told him I would not be coming back to the church. He quickly got back to me, asking why, asking if it was my family, and if I was being forced to not go. However, I ignored him. The emails I revived in the next few weeks were mad. He told me stuff like I should leave my family now and I could stay at the church. He tried to convince me that it was all because of my mother. He even emailed me to say something along the lines of, he won't be surprised if he read in the papers that I was found dead by suicide. I'm very sure he crossed a line there, but I just kept ignoring him. The strangest email I got was one in a binary code, 0011011011, and 10001010. I used a binary code translator, but it all came back as mixed up letters and numbers. None of it made sense. I eventually blocked him. However, it still hasn't stopped. About 2 or 3 times a year, I will get an email from the church. It's either asking how I am or asking about my family. When I get them, I immediately block the email address. But they just keep coming. It's always someone new, saying they heard about my case and they were worried about me. The whole reason I'm writing this is because I just got one the other day, and I thought it would make a good warning. Please, I beg of you, do not go to a Church of Scientology center. If they can make me into a spiteful degenerate in just a few hours, then what can they do with a person in a few months or a year? If anyone has any idea how to block an entire religion or cult from my email, please let me know. And if you are lost in life, sad or upset, then please talk to your family, friends, or a doctor. When you're down, don't let others make you into a monster. Take it from me. After this event, I got help, and I'm a happy, confident person now. Thank you so much for reading, and I hope you have a great day. Oh, and Alan, if you're reading this, you made me into a monster, so for your sake, let's not meet again.